Welcome to Research Renaissance, presented by the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust. Embark on a journey into the forefront of cutting-edge brain science as we feature insightful discussions with a diverse array of guests, from early career researchers pioneering groundbreaking science to influential voices in investment communities, policymaking, and research institutions. Together, we delve into neurological diseases, their causes, treatments, and the quest for cures. Join us in advancing our understanding of the brain and addressing its ailments. Welcome to Research Renaissance. I'm Deborah Westphal, your host and guide through the fascinating future of the brain. Joining me today is Dr. Heather Brenhouse, Professor of Psychology and Director of Graduate Studies at Northeastern University, where she leads the Developmental Neuropsychobiology Lab. Heather is also a 2024 Toffler Scholar. Today, we will discuss her work focused on understanding why childhood adversity can increase vulnerability to psychiatric disorders later in life. So welcome, Heather.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Well, let's just start with what is a neuropsychobiology laboratory?
That is a great question. When I was naming my laboratory, I went through a lot of iterations of what I wanted to be called, and we sort of smushed a lot of terms together there for a reason. Neuro is, I guess, maybe the most obvious choice for me was because we are a neuroscience laboratory. So we're interested in the cells of the brain, how they behave and how they develop. Psychobiology is we're really interested in the biology of behavior. So psychobiology is the study of how behavior is represented in the biology of the brain and the body. And then the body brings me into the biology part because I wanted to make sure that it came sort of across that the lab was not only a brain lab. We're really interested in not just how the brain interprets the environment, which I'm sure we'll be talking a lot about today, not only about how the brain interprets the environment, but also really how the body encodes our environment and our experiences. And so I'm really interested in the systems throughout the body. And that's why sort of the idea of biology really came into play. We wanted to make sure that it really wasn't, we're not only talking about neuroscience per se, and we're not really a bunch of floating heads in the world. You know, we're an entire body experiencing our world. So that's where that all came from.
Yeah, I'm curious because if you had looked back maybe 20, 30 years ago, would there have been such a convergence that would have been necessary to put these three things together?
I think that has definitely become more appreciated in the last few decades. I would say that there were some neurobiologists earlier on that did appreciate that. There was, this early appreciation for sure of neuroendocrinology and how the brain and the hormonal systems throughout the body communicated. But only more recently have we been starting to appreciate how, say, the gastrointestinal system communicates to the brain and the immune system communicates to the brain. And it is true that in the last few decades, it's become more appreciated.
So how did you even get in on this journey to become a neurologist and, neuroscience? And, what was those kind of pivotal points? Just kind of walk us through that journey.
Yeah, it's funny that you say neurologist because that's where I started. As a naive high school student, I took a biology class in, I guess it was 12th grade, and I had an amazing biology teacher who really is the one who turned me on to neuroscience. Not really that she didn't even call it neuroscience. She wasn't teaching us neuroscience per se, but she talked a lot about the mind-body connection. And every time she talked about it, my ears sort of perked up and I started feeling myself get really excited because I started realizing that there was this physical basis to what we were experiencing, right? And the fact that you can actually study that and look at it and ask questions about it. And that got me really excited. And so then I realized that what I was getting excited about was the brain and neuroscience. And so not really knowing what that meant for a career, I thought, well, somebody who likes science, I guess maybe has to be a doctor. I didn't really know much about scientific research. I was a first-generation college student. I didn't really come from an academic background. So I thought, okay, I guess I want to be a neurologist. And so pretty soon after I went to college as a pre-med student, I was exposed to all of this, the research world. And I started realizing that I could actually just spend my entire life asking these questions and looking into these questions and figuring things out and trying to heal disease from sort of the inside out instead of from the outside in. That's what really turned me on.
So why childhood development and, focusing on that side of the equation versus the aging and what we kind of know when we really start to think about, neurology or neuroscientists?
So for me personally, the development side was kind of serendipitous. The first lab that I happened to stumble into as an undergraduate student was a developmental lab. And so I got really interested in development, but that was really fortuitous for me because the more I've learned, the more we've learned as a field, the more we realize that arguably most diseases have some, especially psychiatric disorders and psychiatric diseases, including diseases related to aging, have roots in development. The brain has some really formative time during early development when the brain is designed, really. We've designed our brains, or the brains have designed us. I'm not sure which way, but the brains are designed really to understand what the world is that this particular organism has been born into, right? Each individual has been born into its own environment, and your brain is there to learn about that environment very early on and program itself such that you can actually survive and thrive in that particular environment. And so what your brain is doing very early in development is really going to impact your entire lifespan, including vulnerability to disorders very, very late in life. So I think that development is kind of where it's at, where we really can kind of dig deep in and see not only the root causes, but also the sensitive periods when during later even development, even if things have already maybe say gone awry or changed trajectories early on, later on development, there are these new sensitive periods where you can actually kind of correct these trajectories that might be leading you to vulnerability. So I think development is fascinating and exciting. And I was turned on to it early because I was just lucky. But looking at it sort of even retrospectively, I'm realizing that, it's a good thing that I kind of get into this because I think this is really where the magic really is in terms of getting at the root cause and treating and supporting people who are going to be vulnerable to disease later in life.
So let's talk about that vulnerability. You talk about stress or adversity. That's got to be a spectrum. Can you define what that spectrum is? Because one person's stress is another person's normal life without stress.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. It's something that we all need to always pay attention to because, right, I talk about my lab being a lab that studies early life adversity, but exactly what you said, adversity is a very different thing to different people. There's I'm going to get it wrong, but there's some really great Russian saying about how hot water does something very different to a potato than it does to an egg, right? Like it can soften a potato, but the same amount of hot water can, harden an egg. So it depends on the individual of like how your experience actually impacts you. And so we think about that all the time. And it is a spectrum, your early experiences. And so we really think more not only about, bad experience, good experience. We actually think about, whatever your experience was, what kind of impact has it had on you as a developing individual? And then what can we do? What can we look at within that experience to actually draw some kind of line between what that impact was on your later life, health and wellness. And so just an example that's sort of abstract, but what we think about is instead of thinking about what we're looking in rodents, right, an animal model of early life adversity. And so we do have these different paradigms of stress where we can impart some sort of a stress onto a developing rat. And in our case, in most mammalian species, the most impactful stress you can impart on these animals is a disrupted caretaking environment. And so that is the case where really no matter who you are, if you're a mammal, your developing brain is expecting some predictable amount of caretaking and some type of caretaking. And if you don't receive that, that is basically always in some ways deleterious, right? It's harmful in some ways. But that said, even within that realm of adversity, even if you're talking about a disrupted caretaker relationship, different individuals experience that differently as well. So instead of actually looking at each paradigm and saying, these rats were put through this kind of caretaker stress and these rats were put through this kind of caretaker stress, instead of worrying about that, we do that, but then we actually look at the infant itself. And so we have a few things we've looked at in terms of looking at that measured impact of the environment. One is actually looking at how they vocalize. And so over early development, we've seen that rats actually communicate with each other through what's called ultrasonic vocalizations, which means they're above our range of hearing. The rats can hear it just fine, but we call it ultrasonic vocalizations because they're above human range of hearing. But they communicate with each other, and rat pups communicate with their mother by calling with these little chirps of these vocalizations. And we've actually been able to track the development of the kinds of syllables and chirps they use and how many they use over development. And so there's sort of this normal trajectory of the development of those calls. But then we've seen that if you put an animal through an early adversity, rearing environment with adversity, that trajectory is different. That development is changed as over different ages, they vocalize differently or more or less. But there's individual differences. So we can actually look at those individual differences and how their vocalizations have changed. Again, which is this, we think of it as sort of a more measured impact of, well, what have you been experiencing, right? How has this impacted you? And then we've actually seen that the level of those early vocalizations, that trajectory can actually predict later play behavior with their cage mates and other rats. And so we're thinking about it in that term. And then another measured impact, which is something that the Toffler Trust has actually done us a lot of service funding us to do this research, is actually looking at how that early experience has impacted the timing of their puberty. So each individual, and this is true of humans too, each individual is impacted very differently, again, by their early experiences. And over the entire population, if you're looking at averages, what we see is that an adverse early rearing environment actually leads to accelerated or early pubertal onset. And so we can track how early or late an animal has experienced puberty and actually use that as another kind of predictor of how their brain is developing over their lifespan.
So why the accelerated puberty? You'd think that it would stunt versus accelerate.
Yeah, that's a phenomenal question and point that's really where that's the crux of our question, because it is true that if you think about it in evolutionary terms, if you are about to undergo puberty, which is basically maturation of reproduction, where you can actually then become reproductively capable, you would think that if you are in a stressful environment, you do not want to start having offspring, right? And that is exactly what happens. So it is true that right around in adolescence, if you're in a stressful environment, your puberty is delayed. However, what we're noticing is that earlier stress, so if you've actually been, I'm saying you, like if the rat, but also this is true in humans, if an animal has been under a stressful environment through infancy and say early childhood, if you're talking about humans, in rats, we call it juvenility, the juvenile stage. So if they're under stress during that period, what seems to happen is that then their puberty is accelerated. So it's not that their stress is during adolescence, their stress is earlier on. So an earlier exposure to stress seems to accelerate puberty. And then you start thinking about that from an evolutionary standpoint. If you're in a world, if your brain and your body has been born into a world that is dangerous and threatening, you might want to get those offspring out as soon as possible, right? And so in that case, you actually think about, well, it does kind of make sense where you actually might have accelerated puberty and become reproductively capable earlier on. Obviously, in real life, that winds up being maladaptive and usually harmful. But from an evolutionary standpoint, that does kind of make sense.
So you observe these behaviors. Do you look at their brains too afterwards to see, is there physical changes in the brains of these rats that have gone through this adversity or, this stress?
Yes, many. There's a lot of changes, and some of them you would call them maladaptive. Some of them you might actually call adaptive, depending on the environment and the kind of world that the rat is in. But if you're thinking about just changes, I want to be careful not to just sort of talk about the brain being broken after early life adversity, because that really is not the case. But sometimes these are deleterious changes. So the changes that we've noticed in our lab in the brain, and we're just looking at a small subset of these changes, right? There's many labs looking at many different consequences of early life adversity. What we actually focus on in my lab behaviorally are the brain circuits that control responses to threat. We're interested in how an individual interprets whether the environment is threatening, how they respond to threats. And what we normally see behaviorally is that there is a hypervigilance to threat, which is also pretty translatable to the human condition. When an individual has gone through early life adversity, they do seem to be hypervigilant for threats later on. And we see that we're looking at the circuits in the brain that control those responses and assessments, and they actually are very different. So we actually see, speaking of accelerated maturation, which does seem to be the kind of the overall theme here when we look at early life adversity, we also see an accelerated development of the circuits and actually connections between regions that control response to threats. It's almost as though, to anthropomorphize the brain even a little bit, it's almost as though the brain is trying to catch up with this highly threatening environment and world and try to be able to respond to it very early. And what that means is that the regions of the brain that are not really designed to receive those connections, that early receipt of those projections of those neurons are actually growing and forming synapses, forming connections with those brain regions. If those brain regions are not quite ready to receive those connections, that can actually change the activity within that region, right? So we have this sort of this chain of reactions where we have early development and then some deleterious changes in those regions that are not ready to get those early connections.
I think you've also kind of studied the microglia and the inflammation. And, what are some of these kind of findings that you're surprised about when it comes to the brain?
Well, I mean, the most surprising, I think, thing was that we actually saw so many changes in not only microglia. So microglia are basically the brain's immune cells, the immune cells that are in the brain, and we've actually seen that the morphology, so the shape of these cells, which when it comes to microglia are very cool cells. They actually change their shape based on what they're doing. They can get really bunched up into these sort of what we call amoeboid. They look like little amoeba, or they can get really, really branched when they're sort of looking around and surveying their environment. And so we've actually seen that the microglia in animals that have been exposed to early life adversity, we look over development and the trajectory of the morphological changes of the microglia that you would expect, they're very different in animals that have been exposed to early adversity. And not only that, the first surprise was that it actually changed it. The second surprise was that it was actually sex. There were sex differences between the two. So males actually appeared to be much more impacted within their microglia than females, which was surprising to us because typically we think about, I want to be careful not to misspeak because both males and females are impacted by early adversity in rodents and humans, whatnot. But a lot of labs looking at emotional regulation and anxiety and behaviors like that do tend to report that females are more impacted than males. Males seem to be more impacted in terms of what we talk about as being externalizing types of disorders, which are things like drug addiction and aggression, whereas females tend to be more impacted with internalizing symptomologies like anxiety and depression. And so I'm conflating human and rodent data here, but in humans, that's what we see. And we sort of see the similar things happening in rodents with the kinds of behaviors they show. So when we saw these changes in males only, it's not very often we see early adversity changes in males only. And so we were really surprised to see that microglia are really more impacted in males. And what we're hypothesizing, I should say, is that the male microglia and the immune system, especially in the brain of males, does seem to develop a little earlier than females, which is also kind of, the antithesis of what we normally think. We usually think of girls and females develop earlier. And in general, they do in terms of the brain. But it seems like we do know that in microglia, there's some earlier development in males. And so what we're thinking is that the kind of stress we're putting these animals through, which is very early in development, maybe that's hitting male microglia more than females. Whereas if the stress is more during adolescence, we might be hitting female microglia more. But again, this is all up for questioning. We haven't quite tested that yet, but that's what we're hypothesizing.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious, and this might be kind of tangent here, but we heard a lot about the stress that children in the early development, and then even into junior high, high school, were going through during COVID. is that an adverse environment? Is that, the stress? And are there studies that are kind of coming out, that studies like you do, to try to understand what may be the really long term on these brains?
There are definitely studies that are being done and have been done in people with exposure to the social isolation that was involved in the COVID epidemic. And for us, I can tell you that in rats, there haven't been any that I know of really sort of behavioral studies that were looking at COVID specifically. Maybe there are, I'm not aware of them. But I can tell you that for many years, there has been a lot of research done in rodents looking at social isolation, which is really a big chunk of what we were looking at with what these kids were going through with COVID. I know my kids were holed up at home in front of their computer for many hours a day. I think everybody's were. So there was definitely some social isolation there. And we do know that especially during adolescence, social isolation is a tremendous stressor. Not the case as much for even juveniles, and certainly not adults. So that seems to be a very, very unique stage of development when social isolation is specifically stressful. So, I was saying how we do our early life adversity paradigm, and we look at caretaker disruption, because that's the early life stressor. That's the most impactful early life stressor. If you're thinking about adolescents, caretaker, schmeretaker, whatever, but your peers, right, and your social environment is really, really important during adolescence. The tweens and teens that were experiencing the social isolation during COVID, we were not surprised, and we are expecting that there are certainly going to be some long-term changes that are associated with that. And that said, the brain is so plastic that even that kind of an environment, that kind of stressor, enrichment can buffer that, right? So enrichment from other sources, enrichment later on can certainly buffer those changes and even sort of rewire things that have been sort of miswired. The brain is never really hardwired, right? Even when it's impacted like that.
Well, let's talk about that connection then to later in life. And seems to be so many diseases or conditions as people age. You get the dementias, Parkinson's, ALS. What do you believe is the relationship between this early development and adverse environments to possibly this long-term possibility with the diseases of the brain as we age?
Yeah, I do think that there are certainly connections between the early life environment and later brain aging and aging-related diseases. And a lot of that really is still really up for investigation. There really isn't that much known about that. I do know there are a handful of studies, and maybe more than a handful that I just don't know about, but there's a pretty small number of studies that have looked particularly at rodent models of early life adversity and effects on the aging brain. And they definitely are, seeing changes, right? They're seeing effects. But again, the mechanisms and all of that are not really worked out. The thing that I have a hunch about, which is what I wish I had, limitless years and limitless money to do this work with. I'm not sure if I'll ever get there, but I would love to, because I'm really interested in just the metabolic impact of early adversity. When I say metabolic impact, I really just mean the fact that our brain requires a tremendous amount of just energy. And most of what it's doing is just regulating when and where and how that energy is spent. And what we're noticing after early life adversity, and this is actually something I was just speaking to a colleague about yesterday. I was looking at some data and I thought, I said, this seems really like it just keeps happening. We keep, no matter what we do, no matter what brain region we're looking at, this is just in my lab, over the last several years, I keep noticing that whenever we're looking at just general proxies for brain activity, just cell activity, we always see it's higher after early life adversity, no matter what we're doing, right? And so we've been kind of focusing on different brain regions and different behaviors, and, we report that. But in general, almost always it's up, right? It's hardly ever down. And so I started thinking, is it just that the brain is just really just revving up? It's revved up so high after early adversity that we are just burning through energy, and the brain is having to learn constantly how to, where's a big question, I guess, is where is that energy coming from, right? And so then I started thinking, what are the consequences down the line of all of that? I mean, every time a neuron, a cell, is generating energy, it's creating oxidative stress. That's part of the energy metabolic procedure. Every cell in our body is always creating these little, they're called reactive oxygen species. And that's a oxidative stress, which is something that we try to mitigate with antioxidants, right? We eat lots of berries and nuts and all that, which is great. But at what point, does that oxidative stress just build up because we are just really trying to just constantly utilize so much energy? And what does that do later on? Because a lot of these aging-related diseases do involve increased levels of oxidative stress. So that's a big question that I just sort of would love to ask somehow. But that's a hunch, right? The hunch, I think, is all going to come down to energy metabolism and disorders of energy metabolism as a result of trying to develop so quickly and try to connect these regions so quickly during early life adversity.
It's really interesting because a couple of our other scholars are studying like astrocytes, or there's certain parts of the cell. And their hypothesis is as we age, some of these mechanisms are just aging out. They're just getting tired of doing what they were meant to do. And, because some people get Alzheimer's, some people don't. Why is that? Well, inside their brain, maybe their cellular mechanisms they're exhausted. Well, it's interesting to kind of go back and, if we could, ask those people, what was your childhood? And, I know there's some superager studies. You and I have talked about that, where these people they're cognitively, very young. They're in their 80s, 90s, but yet they're 45, 50 as far as their brain. Did they have less adversity? Did they, did their brains adapt in a way that, it doesn't affect them later on? I think that's super interesting.
Yeah. It's unfortunate that we don't have perspective or longitudinal studies where you actually can ask these questions, but maybe starting now we can. And that's one good thing about animal research, is that we don't have to necessarily wait 80 years for an animal to grow into old age. But obviously there's human specific situations that we can't do with animals, but that might be a really interesting thing to go into animals to look at.
Well, if you had this unlimited funding and you had all this time, what do you think are some of the most important kind of projects or focuses in your area that need attention?
That is a very big question. I think when you first talk about unlimited resources and money, the first thing that kind of comes to mind are all these really sort of cutting edge techniques that are just ways to get into the brain and look at it, that are, it would take too long to really get into the specifics of what they are, but they're expensive. And so there are so many different techniques you can actually do to manipulate certain cell types and certain circuits, and to actually analyze cell activity in certain circuits and certain cell types. So that would be something that would be, it's where the field is certainly going. It just takes, time and money. And then in terms of just, conceptual, questions, I really do think that this energy metabolism is somewhere we really want to go. And I think that would require imaging techniques that are even things like MRI that is actually used in humans. I think we need to do a better job of connecting animal and human MRI. We can do MRI in small animals as well. And so we can actually kind of try to sort of find parallel ways to image the brain in both animals and humans. We can actually look at the same metabolic kinds of measures in animals and humans. I think that actually might really do us really well, because then we can actually take that data and then go even deeper biologically into the animal, but we'd be looking at, again, the same mechanism. So I think that would be a really, really important thing to do. And it would take a lot of labs and a lot of years.
Yeah. You said you made the statement, you kind of think this is where the field is going. Kind of describe what you think in the next 10, 15, 20 years. Where do you think we're going to be with this? Because there's so much technology, and there is a lot of money still going into, and there's going to be, and there's just ways to collaborate that we've never had before. Where do you think, if you kind of peer into 15, 20 years from now, where do you think we would be? What's the discussion we would be having?
Well, I think the easiest answer to that probably the safest answer to that is computational modeling, because that certainly is where the field has been going, and it's only gaining in momentum, right? And so we're just seeing exponential growth in our abilities to do computational modeling, machine learning based things. And so when I say machine learning based, analytical kinds of methods, I'm thinking about even things as simple as behavior, but also as complicated as actually the way neurons work and communicate with each other, because we've been limited until now, right? We've been limited in terms of like what we think we want to look at, what we think we want to study. And the cool thing about these computational models and machine learning models is that now we can just find patterns, just exploratory kinds of experiments. We can actually just let characterize these different patterns in behavior and activity. We can just sort of look and then find differences between experience or, genetic makeup or whatever you want to do, whatever kind of manipulation or difference you want to look at between populations. You can actually just find differences in these categories of behaviors or activity patterns that you didn't even know to look for. So I can't imagine that's actually not going to keep gain momentum, actually really bringing us farther. That's the safe and easy answer, because of course that's where we're going as a field, just like every other field. So I think that would be one thing I would say. And then what I hope we do is we keep appreciating more and more and finding better ways to look at communication between the brain and other systems of the body. We have very rudimentary and fundamental things we're looking at now, which is important, but I hope that we can use these modeling techniques and also these very, just technically sophisticated, we have amazing viral vectors and things where you can actually get into the cell and actually change, one little protein or molecular expression pattern within one cell, where we never were able to do that before. And so I hope that we can continue to use those technical advancements as well as all the computational modeling advancements to actually get at those questions where we're looking at, again, how does our environment impact our gut, right? How does our environment impact our immune system? How does our immune response impact our behavior, right? We know all these things are connected, but we don't have these really sophisticated ways to study them yet. And I'm hoping that's where we're going to be going to in the next, 10 or so years, because I think that's going to teach us a lot that we don't know about disease and aging and behavior and all the things that we're trying to learn.
Do you think that's different from different parts of the world? Because we're kind of US-centric here. And the first question would be, do you have counterparts in other countries looking at this and that adversity and their environment in that development? And then, just your kind of feeling on, because you started with adversity is not this scenario versus that scenario. It is really the relationship with the individual and what it's doing. What are your thoughts as far as kind of in other places in the world? Would we find the same thing?
Yeah, I would definitely say that everything I've been saying has been completely Western-centric in terms of what we know, we don't know. I would say that Eastern medicine has known a lot more about this mind-body connection, right, that I started with, that is really, I think, where it's all at, and the connection between the brain and the environment and the rest of our body. I think that Eastern medicine has done a whole lot more with that and has understood that for many, many, many years. What they don't have in that field are ways to actually manipulate and get the kind of data that generates policy and medications and, and treatments and basically, worldwide treatment, right? And so I wish I did have more counterparts in other parts of the world that I could actually talk to that can actually bridge Eastern medicine with Western. I think that'd be really, really important. So speaking of where we can go in the field, that would be phenomenal if we can actually meld those two sort of ways of looking at health and wellness together. I think it's happening more now than maybe it did 20, 30, 40 years ago, but we still have a lot further to go. But yeah, I do agree that this is a very Western-centric way to think in terms of, we only think about the brain and, we only, treat diseases one way or the other. There's many other types of medicine and treatment that have been a lot further than that, but they just don't have the same techniques to look for data and report it the way the Western world does. And so we don't talk to each other.
Yeah. What do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions that people have about the science behind kind of the brain development and mental health and just general health of individuals?
I think I just thought of three totally separate answers to what you were asking. So one thought I had was when you're talking about misconceptions about development and development with mental health, the first thing that came to mind is this misconception, and I still hear it now, that when people are talking about trauma early in life and adversity early in life, I hear people say things like, it's okay, they won't ever remember. And that's a misconception where it's what we have to really be attentive and sensitive to, which is that, well, they might not have this, what we call a declarative memory of it, where a child might never think of that specific instance again, or even remember it even happened. But memories are formed all over the body. And we're learning that more and more. I mean, there's immune changes from an event, immune system changes from an event that you would never maybe be able to recall in your mind. So that's just one, I think, misconception that it'd be great to make sure that folks really appreciate and attend to. If a child is separated from their family when they're 2, maybe they wouldn't remember it, but that doesn't mean anything, right? Because the stress is still imparted in the brain and the body. So that's one. And then in terms of mental health, I think, my other thought was just turn to just general stigma related types of issues where we still as a society, I think we're so still ingrained in this idea that personality and mental health are sort of just so ingrained in ourself that people have a hard time disentangling who someone actually is from what their personality might be, or their mental state, or a mental illness. So that's something that we, I think, struggle with as a society, right? Within ourselves and with people around us, right? We might try to be sensitive to mental illness, but then we still have this ingrained kind of idea that you can't take someone apart from, their mental state or mental illness. So that's something we struggle with, I think.
I'm curious because at the beginning you talked about the accelerated puberty, and there's research around postmenopausal for women that, especially when it comes to Alzheimer's or the dementias. Do you think your research will lead to maybe better understanding of what that connection could be?
I hope so. Yeah, I think we talked about this a little earlier, and I think it's a fascinating question because accelerated puberty is almost definitely, at least in some cases, linked with early menopause. Sometimes it's actually earlier puberty is linked sometimes with late menopause. And so the timing, I guess what I should say is the timing of menopause is likely linked with the timing of puberty. And I think that would be, and obviously menopause is linked with brain health in older age because estrogen, as an example, is neuroprotectant. And so drop in estrogen can actually certainly lead to more vulnerability to neurons. So short answer is I think for sure it'll be an important thing to look at. And I'm really looking forward to actually looking at the later stages of life and not just the early stages of puberty, because that'll be really fascinating to look at. Also, this isn't what you asked about, but it just brings up to mind. It also makes me think about pregnancy. Pregnancy is this state that we don't really study very much, just as another hormonal change. Yes, we study postpartum pregnancy, postpartum depression, and we study maybe some of the effects of pregnancy. But we don't just think about how pregnancy changes a woman's brain, right? We don't really know that. And so whether these hormonal changes during puberty might be linked with that and with menopause, the whole lifespan, I think, is going to be really important to look at.
Yeah. Having gone through it, it does change something. It would be nice to know what that is, because it definitely does that. How far is your lab away from the process of designing maybe therapeutics? And I'm probably not asking that correctly, but the work that you do, will that shed light that will ultimately possibly be, a vaccination or some sort of, drug that will kind of help in later life?
Yeah, I don't know the exact answer to that question, but I think that there is definitely possibilities that we could speak directly to companies that are looking at different therapeutics, especially since a lot of things we're looking at are molecular pathways that are already targeted by some medications for maybe other types of diseases or disorders. And so I wouldn't be surprised if well, so as an example, right, we're interested in a hormone called corticotropin-releasing hormone, which is part of the stress response, and it's targeted in several different medications and to treat different disorders. And if we can actually target that in order to look at it as a pubertal timer, which is what we're doing, we're actually interested in the fact that it can actually affect the timing of puberty. That might be an easy way to sort of start targeting and treating accelerated puberty. Now, we are several steps away from that. It would really be, we're a basic science lab, which means if we were to figure something out, that would then be brought to preclinical and clinical researchers, and then start discussions with having patents and start discussions with drug developers. But we've actually kind of gone down that path. I can see that happening because we've gone down that path before. We didn't wind up filing the patent, but just an example, sort of the steps that would have to happen. Several years ago, we were looking at a neuroimmune, so a brain immune interaction, where we saw this pro-inflammatory molecule, pro-inflammatory cytokine called TNF alpha. So this is a molecule that's expressed in the brain, but also in the body as a result of immune activation. And it's also just part of brain activity in general. And so we've actually shown that, we showed that early life adversity increased the expression of this TNF alpha in the brain. And if we blocked it, we can actually prevent, this is actually, again, in males specifically, we're able to block an addiction-like behavior in males that were exposed to early adversity. So males exposed to adversity show this addiction-like behavior as well as increased TNF alpha. If we blocked in the brain this TNF alpha in males, we prevented that addiction-like behavior. And so when we did this, we actually used a drug that is used to treat, I think it was maybe rheumatoid. It was originally used to treat rheumatoid arthritis, and the company, we found out about our paper, and they got very excited because they had never used this drug in the brain. And so this is the first time that this drug has actually been used to treat something in the brain. So we talked a lot about what that might mean and maybe filing a patent. So the next step would have been to file a patent and then to see if we can actually use this to develop drugs for brain-related disorders. So that's, normally it's, first you get interest from a drug developer or a clinical researcher, and then you file a patent, and then you go on to drug development.
Yeah. What do you wish that just people out there that maybe not even know a researcher knew about what you do and how far away and how much time it takes to get to that? Because I think there is misconceptions that said, well, we have all this research. Why don't we have the drugs? Why do we still have diseases? Why don't we just fix it?
Yeah, I understand. I wish we could fix it all too. We all do. I think that it's really easy to forget how incredibly brilliant and complicated our brain and bodies are and our biologies are. And the fact that we are in a constantly dynamic environment, internal and external. And one type of treatment for one thing will very likely throw another process off. And so I guess that's all to say that there's so much just general understanding that we need before we can safely treat things that it takes years and years, decades of basic research sometimes, depending on, I feel like our it's not just me, it's been said before, that our modern medicine sort of model has sort of came from when we were realizing we learned what vitamin deficiencies were, right? And it was really easy because when we learned what vitamin deficiencies were, all you do is you take the vitamin, you take a pill, and you're better, right? And so now we've sort of grown up from, I guess that was like maybe the 40s or something. We've grown up in this society where we think, well, all you got to do is take a medicine and make it better, no matter what it is. And it's just not really the case. That never has been, right? It's the case in very, very rare instances, right? And when we can find those instances, fantastic. But other than that, we need to understand multi-system level processes in order to understand how to treat or support a certain condition. And sometimes things are not reversible completely. We can support and treat, right, to sort of increase wellness. So I think that, my two answers to your question are, one, I think people need to understand how long and how many man hours it takes to even understand the basics before we even think about how to reverse things that went awry. decades. Number one. And number two, I think we really need to start thinking more about wellness versus health, I guess, is, we have to think about how to live best, even if things are not, like typically, always typically working, right? Nobody's going to be typical. Nobody's really typical, right? We all have our stuff. And so, obviously there's diseases that we want to treat and there's suffering that we want to treat. But I think that as a society, we're still very fixated on there's a sickness and let's take a pill and fix it. And why can't we just take pills for every sickness? That is never going to happen, no matter how much money we throw at things. So it's probably better to shift our priorities a little bit.
Yeah, in some cases, it's take a pill for any inconvenience that we may have.
That too. Exactly. Right. Exactly. And sometimes it's not even the inconvenience of the person who's taking the pill. It's the inconvenience that they're causing to somebody else.
Right. Right. That's for sure. So, yeah. So, you've got so much passion, and research is not an easy career. What keeps you going?
Oh, the first thing that popped into my head were my trainees, the people who I mentor and advise and train and teach. I think day to day keep me going, even when things are feeling kind of hard, because I'm here largely for them. I feel like, once you kind of reach a certain stage in your career as a scientist, it's all about the next generation. Obviously, I still would hope to produce good research and have an impact myself, but my attention really starts turning to my trainees. And so they keep me going. They're awesome. And I love them. And I keep hitting the jackpot with having these brilliant trainees that are going to just keep changing the world. So that's the first answer. Then the second answer is just that there's always just so much to learn and discover that it's just always exciting. Even, after an hour or two of doing paperwork or getting rejection from a paper or a grant or something, after that's all done, you look down the road and there's another discovery thing to learn, another cool thing you didn't know before. So it's just really fun. Science is fun.
Yeah. I would agree with that. So what is your kind of your greatest hope then for the future? And that's, from a personal perspective as it applies to your professional life.
I would say that my biggest hope for the profession is that our world and society maintains the value of science and facts and data and evidence instead of ideology. We go up and down with that as a society. And so I hope that we maintain some more, some priorities based on truth. I should say truth. And I think that would kind of all science and my field really needs is that at its base. And so that's my biggest hope. And then the other is really just that the younger and earlier stage generation can maintain their hope for the future, because we really need that right now. I think right now where there is a lot of despair, I guess. And so we need that to be lifted in order for folks to really be productive and actually keep this world, keep wellness getting better, I guess, right? Better wellness for everyone.
Yeah, it's super, and I appreciate that. It's super interesting. We spend so much time saying, we need STEM, we need to keep people in STEM, we need to do that. And a big part of that is giving them hope and keeping them energized and not feeling like it's drudgery or, scary, right? It's hard enough. It's just hard enough. You don't get paid much. Things fail. You have to always be writing grants, but it can be very rewarding when you see something and you have some of these findings that you never thought, and then all of a sudden you've got a breakthrough in our understanding that can be shared.
Yeah, they're fewer and far between, but they're worth it. So if you can kind of keep going through and actually, still love the journey, that's kind of the trick, just to enjoy being a lifelong learner. And so as long as you can kind of roll with that, I think everything's going to be okay.
Right. So as we just kind of wrap up here, what is the question I should have asked you, especially as a neuropsychobiologist? What should I have asked you that I didn't ask you?
That's a really hard question after such a great interview. I don't think I have an answer to that. this is not a great answer, but I think this is the best one I have, which is maybe possibly to talk about regrets or things that sort of maybe I wish I had done. And the funny thing is, I don't really even have a great answer to that, but I guess I could tell you in terms of just like filling the gaps, right? Like, what could I have done better? What could have led to more success in those sort of treating disorders? And I think that for that, I would say that as I grew up in my career and sort of learned more, I think that I could have had a better appreciation for researchers that were very much what seemed to be very much outside my field. I think it's so easy for us as scientists to get very, and you say tunnel vision, even tunnel vision, I mean, you're reading and trying to learn so much, but then there's so much more on the periphery that, in my defense, I brought this up on myself, but in my defense, I guess, it's, at some point you have to kind of limit yourself to how much you're trying to learn and care about and understand. But there were times when I think that I assumed that something was just outside my area of interest or expertise. And so I ignored it. And then it was only, years later that I realized, it would have been really good for me to understand that field, right? Or understand that bit of, biology or the brain that I didn't think I cared about before, because it's all important, right? Everything is connected. So, I have a colleague actually he had a brilliant paper where he did with a trainee where they actually did a network analysis of citations, of paper citations, which is, when one researcher references another. And so they did this network analysis of who cited who. And there were these clusters everywhere where these people knew nothing about what these people were doing. And it happens all the time. And so if there was a better way to kind of open each other up to better and more diffuse networks, I think it would be great if we sort of all can share knowledge a little bit better. So so I guess my, the one regret I had is to shut myself off from fields that I should never have shut myself off to.
No, I think that's a fantastic, it's also, a wonderful coaching moment for those trainees and I'm sure you're bringing that to them either directly or indirectly, that especially in this very connected, accelerated, learning environment, we have to take that time, and maybe technology will allow us to do that better. When you were going through school, it probably was, a little harder because we didn't have some of this AI or machine learning. So, that's fantastic. That's a great question. So, Heather, on closing here, how do people get in hold of you if they're interested in your research, interested in funding you, just, want to collaborate?
Yeah, I would love to hear from anybody. So email is probably the easiest. So it's h.brenhouse@northeastern.edu. And so that's probably the easiest, but you can also go to my lab website, Brenhouse Lab at Northeastern. We're also on Blue Sky. But I think email is certainly the fastest and easiest way to get in touch with me.
I really appreciate your time. This has been fantastic. And I love that passion, and you bring a lot of hope.
Thank you very much. This was a lot of fun. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for joining Research Renaissance. For more information and to stay updated, subscribe for more episodes and visit our website at tofflertrust.org. Feel free to call us if you have any thoughts, suggestions, or just want to find out more about the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust. Until we meet again, onward and upward.